We are just a couple of days away to the beginning of free agency, and then we are officially on the road to the NFL draft. So in this video, I want to talk about every single team's biggest need heading into the offseason. But if you guys do go on to enjoy the video, hit the like and subscribe button. Let's hop into it. So we're going to be doing this in alphabetical order, beginning with the Arizona Cardinals. Their biggest need is defensive line. Whether it's an edge rusher or an interior defensive lineman, they could really just use anybody in that room to really become a disruptor. You have B.J. Ojulari, you have Darius Robinson, but you need somebody next to those guys. You need somebody who you feel confident in that can get you close to 10 sacks a season. They just don't have that guy right now, so they need to find a true disruptor. Next is the Atlanta Falcons. A lot of similar things could be said about the Falcons that you could say about the Cardinals. They also do need edge rushers. This team last year really struggled to get to the quarterback throughout a large chunk of the season. It did get a little bit better as the season went on, but this is a team that if you want to make a deep run in the playoffs with Michael Penix Jr., you have to be able to put pressure on the quarterback like we saw the Philadelphia Eagles do to the Chiefs. If I'm the Atlanta Falcons, I am extremely aggressive in trying to pursue some top tier pass rushers. Next is the Baltimore Ravens, and I sound like a bit of a broken record here, but the Baltimore Ravens also could use an edge rusher. Kyle Van Noy had a really good year last year, but he's 33 years of age and is only going to continue to get older. They could really use another body back there who could be another consistent, reliable guy. I don't necessarily think they need a 10 sack a season guy, but they need somebody who can pair alongside what they have already. Next is the Buffalo Bills, and their biggest need is probably cornerback. They do have a couple other needs, and you could probably argue they need another need here or there, but I think cornerback is really the big position they need to look to address. Rasul Douglas is a free agent, and even then, I don't really know if he's greatest CB1 in the league, so if you can find an upgrade there, I definitely do think it'd be worth your time. Next, the Carolina Panthers. Again, broken record. This team needs to find some pass rushers, so they desperately need to find an edge rusher on this team. They had Brian Burns for a couple years, and it was great while he was here, but they made the right decision to move off of him to gain additional draft picks. Now the team is starting to head into the right direction on the offensive end. I think they need to look to address the defense quite heavily this offseason, beginning with a true pass rusher. That will be the beginning of it. Then you can start to focus a bit more on your secondary and your linebacking core and so on and so forth. Next is the Chicago Bears. For the past several weeks, their biggest need has been offensive line, but with the additions of Joe Thuney and Jonah Jackson, kind of fixed up major portions of their offensive line. So they're really their biggest leftover need, probably, I say this again, edge rusher. You have Montez Sweat. You have a couple other guys in there that you feel okay with moving forward, but you really just need somebody next to Montez Sweat who can consistently get pressure on the quarterback. Pass rush last year for the Chicago Bears was a little bit disappointing, so you could really use another pass rusher next to Montez Sweat that can get you, again, close to around 10 sacks. Next is Cincinnati, and they need cornerbacks. This team just really needs a whole new fresh start defensively. This team could also use edge rushers, but they really could just use a true lockdown CB1. Obviously, easier said than done, but if they can go out there and draft or pick up a cornerback that could be their CB1, that would do wonders for this team, especially as defense last year was just straight up terrible. Next is the Cleveland Browns. They hold a second overall pick, so they kind of have their own destiny in their hands. Not to mention they have the Myles Garrett trade potentially happening too. This team needs a quarterback. This has been their biggest need for like the last 15 years. Deshaun Watson, simply put, is not the guy moving forward. And they have to find different ways to work around whether it's a veteran or potentially a rookie quarterback. This team has to get a quarterback for their future, though, because if this team wants to maximize their current roster, they got to find a quarterback that can do so. Next is the Dallas Cowboys. I thought about a couple different positions for the Dallas Cowboys, but ultimately I landed on linebacker. As of when I'm recording this video, the only linebacker they have is really a decent player is Morris LaFau, who was like I believe a third-round rookie from last year. So he had a good rookie season. Needs somebody next to him. DeMarvion Overshown is potentially out for a major chunk of next year. Eric Kendricks is a free agent. I think this team in general just needs to find an additional linebacker to put in there, potentially be your linebacker 1 until DeMarvion Overshown comes, then to eventually probably hop into a linebacker 2 role. Be Jahad Campbell. I like Jahad Campbell. Next is the Denver Broncos. This team needs to find a wide receiver alongside Courtland Sutton. Obviously, you want to build around Bo Nix. You already feel pretty confident with a couple different guys there. But you really need a true wide receiver 2 to pair alongside what you already have in Courtland Sutton. Maybe more ideally, maybe you find a wide receiver 1 and then Courtland Sutton can fill in as that wide receiver 2 role. That would obviously be a bit more of a higher end pickup, but if you just want a really good receiver 2, I think that also does work out because I think Courtland Sutton is a heck of a player. Next is the Detroit Lions. I could have went for a couple different positions here, like interior offensive line, but I'm going to stick with old reliable. I think this team could use a bit of another edge rusher next to Aiden Hutchinson. As of when I'm recording this video, we don't really know what the status of Aiden Hutchinson is at the moment. Will he return to form? Will he slow down a little bit? We'll have to kind of wait and see, because he did suffer a pretty tough injury. But alongside what you have in Hutchinson, they don't really have another true pass rusher that can seriously put pressure on a quarterback. So if this team could find another edge rusher in either the draft or free agency, I think that would do this defense wonders. Next is the Green Bay Packers. With the likely departure of Jair Alexander, I do believe that cornerback is likely their biggest need. Yes, you could have went with edge rusher or offensive lineman, but truth be told, I do think that those positions are somewhat okay as long as you get some development from some younger guys. Cornerback right now is kind of a room where you don't really know what you're going to get from right now. Jair Alexander has been this team's #1 cornerback option for several years now. It looks like they're ready to move on, so I think you need to find his replacement quite badly. Next is the Houston Texans. Interior offensive line is their biggest need. Yes, they could use a wide receiver too because of Tank Dell's injury. Yes, they could use interior defensive linemen, but my God, that offensive line was so bad last year, primarily within the interior. They just released Shaq Mason, so it does look like this team is going to try to find a way to address that O-line. By doing so, I think that this team gives themselves a better chance to make a deeper run, but we'll have to wait and see. CJ Stroud needs that protection. Go out there and find some offensive linemen for him to work with and have a better pocket. Next is the Indianapolis Colts. Their biggest need is probably tight end. There is a reason why every single mock draft is mocking them, either Colston Loveland or Tyler Warren. This is a Colts team that, just simply put, does not have a consistent tight end option that you feel really good about. They've thrown so many different bodies out there, and none of them really have worked out. This team needs to look to find a tight end that can give Anthony Richardson a safety blanket, while also potentially being a bit of a playmaker who can also do some inline blocking. This Colts team has been desperately badly needing one of those, and now I think they can go out there and get it with this year's draft class. Next is the Jacksonville Jaguars. Their biggest need is probably cornerback. The secondary last year was just straight up abysmal. When you have a solid defensive line with guys like Brian Burns and Trayvon Walker and Eric Armstead and so on and so forth, you really need to surround those guys with a competent secondary, and last year the Jaguars just did not really have a competent secondary. I do think in some ways that potentially was on the scheme, but at the same time, scheme can only do so much if players are not performing, so this team probably needs to find a true cornerback one that could play alongside what they already have out there. Next is the Kansas City Chiefs, the team that was the favorite to win the Super Bowl but ultimately fell short. Their biggest need is obviously offensive tackle, and now that they got rid of Joe Thuney, basically the entirety of the offensive line could use a little bit of some work. You have Trey Smith, you had Creed Humphrey, you have Kingsley Suimaitai, who potentially moves inside to play guard, but really you don't feel confident about either tackle position, so I do think that that is probably their biggest need heading into the offseason. It's going to be interesting to see how they address that, because they don't have a ton of money, and they also don't have a top-tier draft pick, so are they going to rely on a late first-round pick to be their starting tackle? We'll have to wait and see. Next is the Raiders, who actually yesterday traded for Geno Smith, so quarterback's off the board. I think their biggest leftover need at this point is probably running back. Last year they tried guys like Alexander Madison and Amir Abdullah, and it just didn't really work out for this team. You cannot go into next season with guys who probably shouldn't even be on rosters at this point, or maybe should be like on practice squads. You have to go out there with somebody who can legitimately change the direction of this offense. I actually now am starting to believe that Ashton Genty potentially could be the pick for the Las Vegas Raiders. You have your quarterback, go give him a solid offensive line with a solid ground game. Kind of think the Raiders could be somewhat good next year, because I think Geno Smith's a heck of a quarterback. Next is the LA Chargers. This team could also use a wide receiver. You have Lad McConkey, you have Quentin Johnston. Your tight end position also does need some work, but really you need a true wide receiver 2/1 next to Lad McConkey. Ideally somebody who can be a vertical stretcher, who can also maybe make some 50-50 catches with good size, good length. Maybe a Darius Slayton. I like that fit quite a bit. Ted McMillan also makes a lot of sense. There's a couple other needs this Chargers team could look to address, but I do think wide receiver might be the biggest one, because this team has just felt like it's been lacking playmakers the past couple years. Would be nice to see them finally address that this offseason. Next is the LA Rams. They are bringing back Matthew Stafford. They're trading Cooper Kupp, so that makes me think that wide receiver is a bit of a need, but ultimately I think their biggest need is probably cornerback. This team just has had so many solid cornerbacks over the years, but they haven't really had that true cornerback one since like Jalen Ramsey was here. I think this team would really benefit from having that true go-to guy who could just be a lockdown performer on the cornerback level. So I think if they can find that sort of guy, it would do this team wonders, because this team is good. It just feels like it's missing that one piece in the secondary that can take for the team from being good to maybe great to, consistently great to one of the best teams in the NFL. Next is the Miami Dolphins, the team that I think is arguably in the worst position in the entire NFL. It's really no secret what their biggest need is. They need offensive line help, whether it's from the tackle position or from the interior, primarily on the interior. This offensive line last year was just simply put not good. They have to look to address it. They have to look to fix it. If not, there's another chance that Tua Tagovailoa goes down with an injury, which we all don't want that. So protect Tua Tagovailoa, protect your offense, and I think by doing that, you got to get some new offensive linemen. So we'll have to wait and see what their options are this offseason. Next is the Minnesota Vikings. This team has a number of different needs. I could have went with a number of other positions, but ultimately, I'm just going to stick with the interior of the offensive line. I think you feel pretty confident about both your tackle positions, but the interior of the offensive line was a little bit of an Achilles heel for this team last year. You obviously have those great weapons. You're probably going to draft a running back. You have a solid defense. Really could use some help on the offensive line, and if they can do so, I think the Minnesota Vikings will be in for another big 2025 season. Next is the New England Patriots. A lot of different needs for this team, but they also have a crap ton of money to go out there and look to address their needs. I think their biggest need is probably offensive line. Last year, that O-line was one of the worst in the NFL. You got to protect your young quarterback in Drake May. I think that they know this, and they're going to be aggressive in trying to pursue as many top-tier offensive linemen in this year's draft, as well as in this year's free agency class. Again, you got to protect your young quarterback because last year he was on the ground way too much. He's also a bit of a turnover-prone quarterback right now, so by giving him a good offensive line, maybe he can hone in that ability. You got to protect your young quarterback, just like the Chiefs did with Patrick Mahomes early on in his career, like the Bills did with Josh Allen, and like the Bengals are trying to do with Joe Burrow. Next is the Saints, and I could have went with a number of different positions, like potentially even quarterback, but I ultimately decided to go with defensive line. This defensive line just doesn't have too many young bodies that you feel really confident in moving forward. Brian Brisset came in last year, and he made some good plays, so you think that he's going to be a big part of your offense moving forward, but you could really use another more young, solid edge rusher. This team likes bigger edge rushers, so I'm looking at guys like Shamar Stewart, Nick Scourton, so on and so forth. If this team could go out there and really address that defensive line, I think it does make their defense a little bit better. Obviously, this is kind of an older team. It's also an expensive team with a new head coach, and they're trying to head into a new direction, and I think if they want to head into that new direction, figuring out some pieces on the defensive line would make a lot of sense. Next to the New York Giants, they got to find a quarterback, because if not, Brian Dable and Joe Shane, you're probably losing your job this offseason. I think that they are in the most interesting position this offseason because they don't have a pick that makes them feel comfortable that they're going to be able to take a quarterback. I think they will, but they're probably not going to be able to get their hands on the one they actually want, which I'm assuming is going to be Cam Ward. And you look at the free agency class, and it's really not that beautiful out there. Honestly, I kind of wish the Giants would have potentially made a trade for Geno Smith, because that would have felt like a potential win-now move. They don't really have anyone in free agency unless you want to go for a Justin Fields or a Trey Lance or a Russell Wilson, which I don't feel pretty confident in any of those guys, especially if my job's on the line. So it's going to be fascinating to see how they actually kind of approach this offseason to figure out who can be their quarterback of the future, while also potentially trying to find a veteran that can step in day one and keep Brian Dable's job. Next to the New York Jets, very similar things that I said about the Giants could also be said about the Jets. They need to have a quarterback. I will say they do have a veteran option in Tyrod Taylor that you feel okay with. Not to mention you also do have Jordan Travis, who is young and still developing, so maybe you want to turn to him and see if he can potentially play. I will say if I'm Aaron Glenn, I don't really want my first year to have a veteran quarterback in Tyrod Taylor and to have a young quarterback in Jordan Travis as my only options, so I would expect them to potentially try to go after a quarterback in this year's draft, or maybe they'll just rock with those guys. I don't think that they could go wrong either way, but we'll be interested to see how they ultimately decide to do this. Next up, the defending champs, the Philadelphia Eagles. They need to find a pass rusher. Obviously, Josh Sweat's probably out the door. You have Nolan Smith. Outside of that, I don't think you feel really confident about anyone. Obviously, they could have brought back Hassan Reddick, but that ultimately did not work out, obviously because of pay. They need to find an edge rusher who can play next to Nolan Smith and Jalen Carter and those guys. So that I would say is probably their biggest need. Their biggest strength last year was how dominant their pass rush is. Obviously, that's how they won the Super Bowl. So if they want to kind of recreate that success, I think they're going to need to find another edge rusher to kind of help get some pressures on a quarterback. Pittsburgh Steelers, I think their biggest need is probably also quarterback. You tried with Justin Fields last year. You tried with Russell Wilson. I kind of have a feeling they're probably going to try to run it back with Justin Fields for another year, but I don't really think that's the greatest option. If I was them, I would potentially be interested in a quarterback if one was to potentially fall in the first round. Maybe Shador falls. Hell, maybe you take a flyer on Jackson Dart to see if he could potentially be somebody. Either way, I think that this team probably needs to look to find an answer for a long-term quarterback, because this team feels like they're an absolute just hell trying to find a guy for the future. But yeah, it's going to be interesting to see kind of like what the Giants Giants and kind of like what the Jets do to who they draft or who they potentially pick up in the offseason to be their quarterback for next year. Next is San Francisco. This is a team that has a lot of question marks to answer this offseason, but I think the biggest one is, what's the deal with Charvarius Ward? Is he out the door? And if he is, who can you find to be your replacement for cornerback one? Obviously, you have Renardo Green, but aside of him, I don't really feel too confident about anybody stepping into that CB1 role. So if I'm San Francisco, I have to find a true replacement, especially because the Niners are trying to get back into contention. And if you want to do so, you got to have a good cornerback next to Renardo Green. So that'll be pretty interesting to see what they do there. Next is Seattle. I think their biggest need now is surprisingly quarterback. You traded Geno Smith to the Raiders, which I understand why they did it, but at the same time, their offense relied so heavily on Geno Smith that at this point, I don't really know if there's a quarterback that can step in there, at least in the free agency market, and make this team successful. I know that there's rumors about Sam Darnold going there, and truthfully, I don't necessarily hate the idea of Darnold going there. I don't know if Darnold is as good as Geno Smith, nor do I think that Darnold can carry an offense like Geno Smith. So if you are the Seahawks, if you do go with the younger quarterback in Sam Darnold, my suggestion would be to target offensive line and really surround him with as much help as possible, because last year Geno was not given a lot of help and he made a lot with it. So I don't know if Sam Darnold can do the same. So it'll be really interesting to see what they do at quarterback. I have a feeling it might be Sam Darnold, and I think it could be a pretty solid fit. Next is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and they could also use an edge rusher. They have a couple different guys out there that you think could potentially get you a couple sacks a season, guys like Yaya Diaby, but I would like to see this team go out there and find a true edge number one. They could also use a cornerback too, but I think edge might be a bit of a bigger need. The Tennessee Titans need a quarterback. Now, they do hold their own destiny. Do they stick in at number one and take Cam Ward? Do they trade back to get an Abdul Carter and try for Jackson Dart? I don't know what they ultimately are going to do. This is a Tennessee Titans team that, I mean, I guess they have answers for who they could potentially have at quarterback next year, whether it's Will Levis or somebody like that, but I don't feel like you want to run that roller coaster one more time because it was really ugly last year. So if I am the Tennessee Titans, I think I got to find a new answer at quarterback this year. I don't think you want to go into next year with Will Levis. That probably wouldn't be the best look for your organization. And lastly, the Washington Commanders, and yet again, old reliable here. The Commanders need an edge rusher. They just don't really have anybody outside of Dorrance Armstrong, who's actually on the roster. Obviously, you can bring back Dante Fowler, who had a great year last year, but even if you do bring back Dante Fowler, are you expecting the same level of productivity? Like, he had like over 10 sacks last year, and I believe it was the first time in his career, and he's obviously getting up there in age. So can you rely on that consistently? I don't know. I mean, obviously Frankie Louva can get to the quarterback. You have Jerzon Newton, but really this team could really use a go-to pass rusher that you feel confident in that's also younger. So maybe that's a Myles Garrett. I'll just throw that out there. But you guys let me know in the comment section below, what do you guys think about every team's positional need? Let me know your favorite team and what position you'd like to see them draft in this year's draft. And if you enjoyed, hit the like and subscribe button. Love you guys. Peace.